Hey everyone! Around 1400 CE, medieval thinking gave way to a new era called the Renaissance. The term Renaissance literally means rebirth, and the era is best known for the many advancements made in art and science. There was a renewed interest in the culture of classical antiquity and the long forgotten wisdom and skills of ancient Greece and Rome. It was the new Renaissance thinkers, called humanists, that began to refer to the previous era as the Dark Ages. Their enlightenment began with looking back to classical antiquity, but they did not imitate or recreate it like we will see in later revival periods. This new mode of thinking, called humanism, is centered on the human experience and gives importance to the individual, as compared to being centered on religion, a higher power, and the supernatural or religious dogma. So, humanism is a secular ideology which supports reason, ethics, and justice, and specifically rejects supernatural and religious dogma as a basis of morality and decision making. The movement started most notably in Florence, Italy. There was new interest in the physical world, astronomy, and geography. You might remember church heretics like Copernicus, Galileo, and Columbus, and theories about the Earth being round versus flat, and that the Earth was not the center of the universe. There was new interest in human anatomy. You might remember Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, the Vitruvian Man. And with advancements in movable type, printing, and paper, these great new ideas and ways of thinking were able to spread. From Florence, Renaissance thinking spread to Milan, to Rome, and to other Italian cities, and then over centuries to every part of Europe. Many eras of design are characterized and broken down into three main periods. The Renaissance is no different and repeats the same pattern as other eras of design. An early period known for its hesitant and more reserved beginnings, a triumphantly successful high period, followed by a period of over-the-top decadence and decline. So think back and you'll remember the same pattern as French Gothic. Filippo Brunelleschi was one of the first important people in the early Renaissance. He was from Florence, where the Renaissance essentially started, and was the prototype for the versatile Renaissance man. He had his hands in many trades, starting with goldsmithing and moving into sculpture, geometry, architecture, and engineering. Brunelleschi completed one of the most famous buildings in the Florence skyline, called the Duomo, by adding the dome roof structure to the previously unfinished Gothic cathedral in Florence. The Duomo's construction originally began in 1296 by Florence's greatest architect of the time, Arnolfo da Cambio. Construction was slow and haphazard through the 14th and into the 15th century. In 1366, Neri di Fioravanti created a model for the hugely ambitious cupola. This was to be the largest dome in the world, surpassing Rome's Pantheon. But when it finally came time to build the dome in 1418, no one was sure how or even if it could be done. Florence was faced with a 143-foot hole in the roof of its cathedral, and one of the greatest challenges in the history of architecture. Fortunately, local genius Filippo Brunelleschi was just the man for the job. Brunelleschi won the 1418 competition to design the dome, and for the next 18 years he oversaw its construction. The 37,000 tons of weight and 4 million bricks required Brunelleschi to invent hoists and cranes that were engineering marvels. Two of the innovations used to establish the dome's structural identity are a dome within a dome design and a novel herringbone bricklaying pattern. Perhaps the most remarkable, he actually executed the construction without a supporting wooden framework, which had previously been thought indispensable. The most notable thing about this dome is that it was built without flying buttresses. And the top of the dome has an oculus that opens into a lantern, allowing light to pour into the cathedral. Instead, the weight of the structure is supported by the large stone ribs you see on the outside. that are tied together with chains of stone, ring, and iron and act as tension rings. So I take students to study abroad at our Prado campus quite a bit in the summers, and we always take a field trip to the Duomo. One of the most fun things about going to the Duomo is you can actually climb the dome and go up to that little lantern at the top. So if you can see closely enough in that picture, you can actually see little teeny tiny figures, so you can get a sense of scale, standing around the base of that lantern at the top of the dome. But the way that you actually go up is in between the domes. So I talked about this dome within a dome construction. So there's an exterior dome and an interior dome. So in the picture on the slide, you see the exterior dome from outdoors, and you also are seeing a picture of the interior dome, which of course on the inside has frescoes painted all over it. So when you're climbing the dome, you're actually walking between the two dome structures. There's 472 stairs to get to the top. It's like I call it the Florentine Stairmaster. So the way that you go up and over, the steps become more and more steep as you're on that vertical incline, and then they get less and less steep as you almost approach standing on top of that dome. And then you can pop out and walk around that little lantern, and you have a 360-degree view around all of Florence. It's quite amazing. So I wanted to tell you a little bit more about Brunelleschi and his interiors. His interiors exhibit the use of symmetry and classical Roman elements, the defining characteristics of the early Renaissance. So here are two examples, the Pazzi Chapel in Santa Croce and the Old Sacristy in San Lorenzo. You can see the rondelles. These are classical architectural features. On the wall surfaces, you see these round rondelles. And you also see them in the pendentives, which go between the arches. You can see that rondelle there too. We also see from classical architecture the Corinthian order, pilasters and entablature. Both of the interiors that you're looking at are square, and they're topped by a dome as well, which also is a classical architectural feature. When I say classical, which you'll hear me say a lot in this lecture, I'm referring to the classical style architecture of ancient Greece and Rome. So in the Old Sacristy of San Lorenzo, which is the picture on the right of Brunelleschi's designs, there's a central altar table that's placed over the tomb of Giovanni de' Bici de' Medici and his wife, which is recessed in the floor. So for this reason, the Old Sacristy is also sometimes called the Medici Chapel, after this extremely important Renaissance family who we'll hear a little bit more about. So although Florence was a republic, the de' Medici family was the most powerful family of the Renaissance in Florence, wielding political power and financing some of the world's greatest art. In the 15th century, the Medici Bank was one of the most powerful companies in all of Europe, with branches from Naples to Milan and Geneva to London. The head of the family, Cosimo il Vecchio, established the family's position of power in Florence and was the unofficial ruler of the Florentine Republic until his death. Cosimo's most visible achievement in the city was the new Palazzo Medici, their family palace in the center of Florence. Its decoration and furnishings were an expression of his artistic and intellectual aspirations, and a testimony to his discernment as a patron of the arts. Florence's golden age occurred during the reign of Cosimo's grandson, Lorenzo de' Medici. Lorenzo was not only an astute politician, but also a highly educated man and a great patron of the arts as well. He was called Il Magnifico. He gathered around him poets, artists, philosophers, architects, and musicians. Lorenzo's son Piero proved fairly inept at handling the city's affairs and only governed the city for a short time. He was run out of town in 1494. A religious figure, Girolamo Savonarola, remember his name, it'll come up later, was instrumental in restoring the Republic of Florence, ruled by a representative council. Savonarola denounced Florence's excesses, He urged Florentines to toss out their new worldly possessions, from frilly Renaissance dresses to Botticelli's paintings, and throw them into a bonfire of vanities. After a decade of unrest, the Republic fell and the Medicis were recalled to power. The line of Medicis actually died out in 1737. The de' Medici coat of arms, or family crest, which you see on the glass and architectural details here, can be seen all over the city of Florence. The Medici Palace was built by Michelozzo di Bartolomeo for Cosimo Vecchio in 1444 CE. This urban palace in central Florence rises about 70 feet above the ground. Long string courses of stone visually separate the three stories, each of which progressively decreases in height, and the surfaces become smoother with less visible joints as you go up. So, in other words, the building becomes more refined as it ascends upward. It's meant as a metaphor. There's a columned central courtyard in the middle of the Medici Palazzo. It again uses Roman details typical of the early Renaissance. The 12 Corinthian columns support arches for the surrounding loggia. A loggia is an architectural feature that refers to an exterior gallery or corridor at ground level, open to the air on one side, where it is supported by columns or pierced openings in the wall. For decoration, again, you can also see rondelles and the painted festoons. So, how can you tell if something is an actual ancient Roman piece of architecture or a Renaissance construction? So, one way to tell is if you see two arches coming together into a single, smaller scaled Corinthian column. That means it's from the Renaissance. The Romans would have been too afraid to do this in terms of carrying the structural weight and support. They would have used a column for the bottom of each arch. So they would have had their arches coming each to their own individual columns. And the columns themselves would have been much larger, meaning like fatter and taller. Leon Battista Alberti was a scholar, musician, artist, theorist, and writer, so another Renaissance man. His work is credited with the beginnings of a theoretical approach to architecture using concept-based design. Much of his work is devoted conceptually to translating harmonic proportions from music, or the ratios used in musical notation, into architecture. So translating music into architecture. In about 1450, Leon Battista Alberti planned the facade of the Tempio Malatestiano in San Francesco in Rimini, with a simple rhythm of open and closed arches. Arches 12 feet wide alternate with piers 6 feet wide in a ratio of 2:1. The height of the springer, which is set at 18 feet, is in a ratio of 3:2 to the width of the arches. These are simple numerical proportions representing octaves and fifths by analogy with the rules of musical intervals. Alberti wanted to offer the eye the same aesthetic pleasure as the equivalent numerical proportions that music creates for the ear. Here you can see some of the breakdown of these elements' relationships in measurement, which are in black, and in ratio, which are in red. I also wanted to point out his use of coffered ceilings. I don't know if you can recall where we saw this architectural detail before in ancient Rome. Think about it a little bit. But again, a coffer is a sunken panel in the shape of a square, rectangular octagon in the ceiling, soffit, or vault. We'll move here into the High Renaissance. Donato Bramante's career marks the beginning of the High Renaissance, starting with his first work, the remodel of Santa Maria Presso di San Sotiro. Bramante continues the use of classical architectural elements in his designs. An interesting place in this church is the chapel shown in the images on this slide. Because the church was limited in expansion due to a street outside, he had the end wall of the church painted to appear as if there's a barrel vaulted ceiling and choir space. The ability of Renaissance artists to create such an effect stemmed from their newly acquired knowledge of perspective. The painting effect created false perspective. It's called trompe-l'oeil, which is a visual illusion in art, especially used to trick the eye into perceiving a painted detail as a three-dimensional object. Bramante also designed using the concept of harmonic proportions in the Tempietto in Rome, like Alberti. Here, Bramante wanted to plan his architectural elements to have a proportional relationship to each other and to the whole composition. The total width to the total height of the Tempietto is in a ratio of 3:4, which is a fourth in musical intervals. The portico has a proportion of height to width of 3:5, which is a major sixth in musical intervals. The drum above the portico is in the same proportion, so they relate to each other in a 1:1 ratio, or in unison, in musical intervals. The enclosed drum has a ratio of width to height of 2:3, which is a fifth, and with the addition of the dome, 2:4, which is an octave. The width of the colonnade also matches the drum to create another visual octave. The urban palaces during this time continued to be fairly simple and with decorative details limited mostly to elaborate fireplace mantels, classically framed doorways, coffered ceilings, decoratively tiled floors, minimal furniture, and hanging tapestries. However, fresco painting most or all surfaces in a room, creating a gallery, became increasingly popular. Frescoes are several related mural paintings done on plaster or walls of ceilings. The word fresco comes from the Italian word affresco, which derives from the Latin word for fresh. This is because the technique for painting frescoes is on a moist plaster surface, with colors ground up in water or a lime-water mixture. The image in the slide is the Carracci Gallery, which is entirely covered by Annibale Carracci's mythological scenes. Carracci is one of the most famous painters of this time. The scenes are framed by painted, simulated architectural details. The gallery is in the Farnese Palace in Rome. The Farnese family, like many other wealthy and powerful families, like the de Medicis, were the patrons of the greatest artists and architects of their time. In the small pictures on the left, you can see an exterior facade of the palace and the interior courtyard. Antonio de Sangallo the Younger was the designer hired by the Farnese family to complete their grand Roman palace. The court is a square with colonnades in the classic Roman orders at each of 3 levels. The ground, or first level, is correct Roman Doric. The second is Ionic, with pedimented windows fitting within each arch. And the third was planned Corinthian, but Sangallo was replaced by Michelangelo as architect in charge. Michelangelo omitted the arches and substituted overlapping Corinthian pilasters and framed the windows with curved pediments. We'll mention this again later in the lecture. The studiolo, which is a small study or room for contemplation in the Ducal Palace, is one of the most famous works displaying the humanist ideology of the Renaissance in intricate wood inlay. This room is only about 9 by 9 feet, but the walls are covered by an illusionary intarsia, which is a marquetry technique where small pieces are cut out of a panel of wood, and the gaps are then filled with pieces of a different color or type of wood, or maybe ivory, to create a picture. The artwork displays symbolic objects representing the liberal arts, which were so important to humanism. The benches hold musical instruments, and the shelves contain representations of books and musical scores. Scientific instruments, including an astrolabe and an armillary sphere, study furnishings, including a writing desk and an hourglass, weapons and armor, and various other symbolic gestures reflecting Federigo's life as a duke and his devotion to classical and humanistic studies and the liberal arts, especially mathematics and geometry. He was also very passionate about architecture and wrote that mathematics and geometry, being based on scientific truth, are the most important of liberal arts, as well as the very foundation of architecture. This statement is key to our understanding of the spirit of mathematical humanism that is reflected in the details of the decoration of the Gubbio's studiolo. Here we see another marquetry technique called certosina, in which geometric patterns, circles, triangles, and rectangles, of ivory or bone are inlaid in wood. Certosina is named after the Certosa church in Pavia, where the famous altarpiece shown here in this slide was made. We see certosina features particularly in Italian furniture of the 16th century. Venice is often credited with its origin because its designs are strongly tinged with Near Eastern influences, like that of the Islamic geometric designs. In the late Renaissance, the system of thought of humanism is replaced by mannerism. Mannerism generally refers to a freedom of personal expression in artwork, architecture, literature, and music. So do you remember how we talked about the typical pattern of phases within an era of design? Kind of like in the French Gothic flamboyant stage, in the late Renaissance, the term mannerism was used to describe the great freedom and elaborate design typical of the ending phase of an era. In painting, the Mannerist style introduces figures that seem in motion, gestures that appear theatrical, and compositions that are active and complex. In design, Mannerism refers to details that stray away from the rules, that are sometimes eccentric, even humorous in their shifting and distorting of Renaissance serenity. Personal decisions began to take the place of earlier rules that adhered rather strictly to the classical styles. So remember when we were talking about the Farnese Palace earlier, about Michelangelo? He took over that project at the end and added his own twist on the third Corinthian level. This was him imposing his personal modifications on classicism. At San Lorenzo in Florence, Michelangelo designed the new sacristy and the Medici tombs within. The new sacristy is in the south transept of the church, on the opposite side from the old sacristy, which is in the north transept, which we saw earlier designed by Brunelleschi. Michelangelo's plan for the new sacristy is the same simple square, with a dome on pendentives, just like Brunelleschi's serene and classical design, but the treatment of the interior is active, aggressive, and personal. The dark gray pilasters and moldings stand out against the white walls. The space is entered by small doors near the corners so that a visitor confronts the space on one side rather than on an axis. And each panel of wall holds a false blind window with a pedimented frame of unusual, not classical, form. Actual windows are placed high up in the attic or clerestory level that repeats the pattern of columns with pilasters and real windows above the blank window frames below. The total impact is highly dramatic and is said to be tragic in tone. In contrast to Michelangelo, the work of Giulio Romano is said to be humorous in tone, like theatrical comedy. In the Gonzaga family palace's Sala dei Giganti, Romano plays with symbolism and tricks the eye in a fresco covering the walls of the Sala. The Sala is a reception room, based on the myth of the fall of the Titans. Giants are hurling down the stones, seemingly of the building itself, while the swirling circular pattern on the floor is almost dizzying. It's said the scene amused and horrified the Gonzaga family and their guests when they saw it. So, just a side note, the Sala was the main room in a Renaissance palace. It was the grandest and most ornamented, where important guests might be received. Romano's architectural work showed a desire to shift, modify, and distort accepted classical formula. If you look at some of the pictures on the left, you can see his pediments float way above the windows with keystones that seem to have slipped down out of the arch or have been pushed up out of line. Entablatures are placed just sort of here or there, not lined up with one another, and suggest an almost mischievous disrespect for the rules of classical design. This, along with his strongly dramatic tendencies, are the qualities that justify the designation Mannerist. Although Palladio's career was during the late Renaissance that we're talking about now, he was actually not a Mannerist. Palladio has a closer relationship with Alberti and Bramante and their use of harmonic proportions and the golden ratio in architecture. He's also famous for his grid system of designing spaces, which uses mathematical ratios to plan the relationships of spaces in his buildings to harmonic proportions. Palladio was one of the most influential figures in Renaissance neoclassical architecture. His name is still used today for a style of window that he used, which is an arrangement of an arched opening with a rectangular opening on each side. It's called a Palladian motif or a Palladian window. Furniture evolved in the first half of the 16th century. Its forms remained identical to those of the 15th century, but the Italian decorative repertoire and themes began to be assimilated with greater ease. Columns, scalloped shelves, and medallion busts were decorated with highly inventive grotesques inspired by antiquity. We also see decorative detail with Roman architectural features, like you see here on this chest. As with artwork, wealthy and powerful families were the patrons and sponsors of craftsmen that made furniture for them, like these chests. Chairs also became increasingly available and replaced simple benches and stools. This began the movement towards fully furnished interiors. The wealthy began to be the collectors of many accessory items, such as books, papers, documents, maps, jewelry, changes of clothing, table coverings, tablewares, musical instruments, timepieces, scales, globes, and works of art. This piece of furniture, called a cassone, or cassone, was used to store and display these items of luxury. The cassone is a chest with a hinged, liftable lid. Techniques for surface decoration included intarsia, serticina, relief carving and painting, or gilding. The cassone was a traditional bridal or dowry chest, and thus a really important symbol of wealth and power. There were also small cassoni that were jewelry or treasure boxes. It was custom for every great family to order a pair of cassoni as wedding gifts for the bride and groom. The coat of arms for each family was usually found on the facade of each cassone. The cassone had the greatest artistic value of all domestic furniture, and so great artists and skilled craftsmen strived to be commissioned to make these. As mentioned, the cassone would hold items like changes of clothing. Fashion during the Renaissance in Italy was an age of pomp and pageantry. It was colorful, extravagant, and spectacular. The pageantry of festivals, the silks of velvet costumes, and the gold jewelry of its citizens provided a never-ending display of spectacle and color. The cassone could also hold tablewares and musical instruments. Dining, which would take place in the sala, was a highly sociable activity, whether an elaborate feast or an ordinary family meal. It brought the household and its guests together to eat, drink, and talk. In the past, many people sat on benches and shared a communal dish, but now the individual table setting was beginning to emerge. This required a separate chair and cutlery, plates, and a glass for each person. Ceramics, glass, and pewter began to replace traditional wooden tableware. More courses and new dishes, such as mixed meat and vegetable salads, were introduced. The table became crowded with an array of new forms, from cooling vessels to the first flat plates, from wine glasses to egg cups. These, in turn, created an increased awareness of etiquette. By entertaining guests, families could elevate their status and put into practice the social skills that were now regarded as a sign of nobility. Conversation and dancing, for example, were meant to show accomplishment. A modification to the cassone, called a casapanca, had the addition of a back and/or arms to be used as seating and storage. This developed into a multiple-seat unit that was solid, massive, and rectangular, and usually mounted on a dais, which we talked about in the medieval period, called a raised platform. Being covered with cushions and rugs, this casapanca became the forerunner of the sofa. Scabello is the Italian word for stool. It is used for dining and as general seating. It has a hexagonal seat with a solid back that is carved of wood. The earlier versions had a 3-leg base support, and later versions used a trestle base made of 2 ornamental boards with a single crosspiece for stability. The chair has no armrests. The chair on the left has a round coat of arms on the crest of Filippo Strozzi. He was head of a prominent Florentine banking family. And so these kinds of chairs, the scabello, were the kind of chairs that started taking the place of those individual place seatings at dining tables, as opposed to more communal style eating habits, where before, during the medieval period, we had just long benches to sit together. Here's a more elaborately decorated scabello. The Savonarola chair is a folding armchair that was a widely used piece of furniture. It's made up of many curved strips of wood, called cruciforms, that pivot at the center of the seat. It was named after the famous Italian preacher, Girolamo Savonarola, who favored this design. Remember, he was the guy in the Florentine Republic who, after the de' Medici family fizzled out there for a little bit, he took over and encouraged all of the Renaissance people to get rid of all of their fancy things and paintings and dresses and put them in the bonfire of vanities. That's this guy. So typically on this Savonarola chair, you'd also see a cushion that would be used for the seat. The back detaches and the chair folds up. So it's very portable to be moved around. The Dante chair is similar to the Savonarola, but has a more solid frame. It pivots in the same way with 2 sets of cruciforms, curved X-shaped legs, and stretchers that connect the front and the back legs. Leather or velvet was used as the material for the seat and back. It was slung from the side rails so the chair can still fold up and be portable. So these are just very practical designs. Here we see a Renaissance bedroom, which is called the camera. The bed, like a chest, was part of the marriage dowry. Ladies of high birth not only received their guests in their chambers, but also reclined, beautifully dressed on their beds. The beds themselves would also be covered in brightly embroidered silk and wool linens. The camera of the Palazzo Davanzati has been nicely preserved. The floor is tiled, and the ceiling, which is of exposed wood construction, is painted with a decorative pattern. The furniture is minimal: a bed, a cradle, a chest, and 2 chairs. But the room is richly decorated by the fresco painting on the wall surfaces, with repeating patterns on the lower portions, frieze level, and arcaded pattern above. Strong reds give an overall effect of warmth. A shuttered window and the corner fireplace complete the functional equipment of the room. The camera was the room where people washed, groomed, dressed, and undressed. In the wealthiest households, more specific spaces, such as a bathroom, began to emerge, but most families relied on equipment kept in the camera. Clothing, towels, and basins were mostly stored in chests or in a new item of furniture, the wardrobe. Lavatories, often situated in areas close to the camera, were common, but people mostly used chamber pots to go to the bathroom. Both men and women used artificial aids to alter their appearance, including makeup and dyes for their beards and hair. They wore structured doublets and metal corsets to shape their bodies in accordance with contemporary ideas of fashion. Ugh. Households displayed religious art throughout the interior to advertise their faith and encourage good behavior. In the late 16th century, the religious reforms of the Council of Trent imposed a degree of control over these images and also encouraged elite families to build their own domestic chapels. Silks were the favorite textile of the Renaissance. They display large-scale patterns woven in strong colors. Velvets and damasks were dominant in the early Renaissance, and brocade became more popular in the later Renaissance. Here's an interesting interior of the sala at the Villa Barbaro. It is very hard to tell if the architectural detail is real. Trompe-l'oeil effects are done in fresco, the columns, doorways, pediments, etc., and the famous little girl peering out. There's another painted doorway with a young gentleman standing in it, sort of waving you in. And then there's a whole other wall that appears to have a hall with a doorway at the end that leads outside to a garden. The Renaissance ideals and styles spread from Italy outward to France and Spain. France's military presence in Italy from 1494 to 1525 helped to spread the Italian ideas back to French aristocracy. The Renaissance spread to Spain from France and from Spanish architects traveling and working in Italy. In France, the Gothic style had been employed with passion, and the greatest of the Gothic cathedrals had been built there. So naturally, France was pretty slow to move beyond their beloved Gothic vocabulary. In other words, Gothic was kind of hard for them to get over. French Renaissance style typically used Gothic structural forms with Renaissance ornament applied to it. In the images in the slide of Château de Chambord, we see how they adapted their medieval designs to show influences of early Renaissance style, symmetry, and orderly planning. Notice small details such as Roman-inspired column capitals and coffers. The Louvre in Paris, designed by Pierre Lescot, establishes the vocabulary of French classical style. On the exterior, we see 2 stories and an attic done in classical motifs. At the Château des Maisons, François Mansart designed a high and prominent tiled roof that would become a hallmark of French Renaissance design. There's a really interesting reason for this design. Attic space was exempt from real estate taxation, so Mansart pulled a trick. He designed the roof to be really tall and steep to cover a full-height attic space. This made the attic usable for living space, but remained untaxable. Later, in America, this roof style becomes popular in the Victorian era, and we call it a mansard roof, after its original designer, François Mansart. Here we see the Renaissance interior of the Château des Maisons by François Mansart. At the Palace of Fontainebleau near Paris, France, we see several indicators of Renaissance style on the interior. We see this gallery-style painting decoration, elaborate Mannerist sculptural wall carvings, coats of arms as decorative detail. Moving on to something unique about Spain. In the Spanish Renaissance, we see a unique design motif called mudéjar that combined the design language of the Islamic, Moorish, and Gothic Christian designs. The style also has characteristics of geometric ornament like the details we saw in the Sarracena wood ivory inlay work. The image in the slide shows a mudéjar-style wooden roof in the chapel of Sintra Palace. La Seu in Zaragoza is another example of mudéjar architecture. Notice the combined Gothic-style architecture with Moorish Islamic details on the walls. Another unique aspect of the Spanish Renaissance is plateresco. Plateresco is a term that describes work from the early Renaissance in Spain that is inspired by the silver and goldsmiths called plateros. Notice all the gold plating. And last mention, I'd like to talk about desornamentado. It's a more reserved Spanish Renaissance style that exhibits classical characteristics. This is the Escorial in Madrid. Notice you also see Doric columns below and the Ionic columns above, seeing the classical details in architecture that we see throughout the Renaissance design style. See you next time.